Good morning, church. I want to add my Happy Mother's Day to the other Happy Mother's Days that have already been spoken. It's my prayer that today's message, as we continue our series, Messy, would be an encouragement to everyone, whether you're the mom that would say, man, everything is going great, or whether you're the mom that says, everything is falling apart, or whether you're the woman who wants to be the mother, or you're the child who has a strained relationship with your mother today. It's my prayer that this message would be an encouragement to you this morning. We're going to look at a family in the Bible who, like every family, had some level of dysfunctionality. I don't know if that's a word, but it didn't flag in my Word document, so I'm going with it. They were messy. They were messy. That much shouldn't surprise us. We began this series 2 weeks ago looking at the first family in Genesis chapter 3, and we established this idea that the reason family life is so often messy is because families are made up of sinners. You can't actually make a family without sinners. We said that as no child has ever been raised in a home without sinners for parents. And so what surprises me in this story is not the idea that this family is messy, but it surprises me, or I could even say just encourages me how God gets involved in their mess. He shows up. He helps them when they're at maybe their messiest. And so let me share our main point, and then we will get to some backstory for our text today. Our main point today is this: we can trust God no matter how messy life has become. We can trust God no matter how messy life has become. You might say easier said than done, and I would agree with you, but that is the encouragement today. 2 weeks ago, we were in Genesis 3. Today, we'll be in Genesis chapter 16. I counted in the genealogy, I believe I looked in Luke, 21 generations passed between Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 16, but the Bible only takes a brief pit stop to talk about a guy named Noah, and what we hear is that the world had become so wicked that God says, I have to send a flood and start over. That's what we get. We get Adam and Eve, very, very little about their descendants. We get Noah, and then in Genesis chapter 12, we pick up with a guy named Abram. You may know him as Abraham, but this is before he has his name changed. His name actually gets changed in the chapter after we're looking at today. But we read that God appeared to Abram, told him that he needs to depart where he is, the only place he's known, and go to a new place. He doesn't even tell him where it is, but he says, I'm going to show you the place. And this time, Abram is 75 years old. He and his wife, Sarai, have yet to have a child, but God promises to make him a great nation. Abram obeys, but we soon find out after Genesis chapter 12 with this great act of obedience that Abram was a very selfish man. You guys may know the song, well, Father Abraham had many sons, right? There we go, right? But Father Abram had narcissistic tendencies. So I could sing that. Father Abram had narcissistic tendencies, and narcissistic tendencies had Father Abram. We see this because they stop in Egypt, right? They stop in Egypt, and when they get there, Abram's like, I'm in trouble. You're beautiful, and if they know that I'm your husband, they're going to kill me to take you. So here's the plan. Tell them you're my sister, and then they'll leave me alone, and I don't know what's going to happen to you, but I'll be all right. Narcissistic tendencies. But anyways, as Sarai agrees, and what happens is she's taken to live in Pharaoh's house. Did they know that was going to happen? I don't know, but that's what happens. And we could just glance past that. We could just say, well, that's just a thing that happened. It's in the past. It doesn't really matter, but I've done enough counseling to know that decisions like this tend to have repercussions that take time to heal from and work through. And there's no evidence that they ever did that. So while Sarai is living in Pharaoh's house, Abram is living it up because Pharaoh gives Abram, says, servants, You're going to remember that. He gives him servants and animals. And so he's living his best life. But Sarah, I can only imagine the turmoil that she feels having to live in Pharaoh's house, at being put in the situation, not to protect her, but to protect her husband. See, I happen to believe that the Bible teaches that it's not a wife's job to protect her husband, but a husband's job to protect his wife. And at this point, Abram fails. And God's going to intervene, but if he hadn't, like, was Abram okay just to let his wife live in Pharaoh's house while he's living it up, doing whatever he feels like doing? We don't know. But by the time we get to our text today, there's all this past hurt that's occurred. You know, one of a common phrase, if you're in a counseling session, and so maybe you've been on the person receiving the counseling like I have, and one of the common phrases you might find yourself saying is, let me tell you the backstory. Let me tell you the backstory. Because you might say something, and the counselor might give you a look like, did you really do that? And they're like, well, let me tell you the backstory. Let me explain how we got here. And you're like, well, you see, this happened, and this happened, this happened. And so the counselor, if they want to be like direct, they're like, so you're telling me because this happened, this happened, this happened, you have permission now to be a jerk, right? That's what happens. See, one thing that makes family life so messy is it's rarely just about the present. In our minds, we have all this past history and things that we bring into the present, which, unless we deal with it, that's kind of just what happens. And it makes things messy. You're going to see that in our story today. But I told you God intervenes, and the way he intervenes is miraculous. He sends plagues on Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh somehow finds out that it's because he's taken somebody's wife, and he's like, all right, you need to leave. And Abram, you need to leave. I don't even care about all the stuff I gave you. Just get out of here. And they get out of there, but they get everything they were given. And so now they're rich. You say, well, their marriage may have been a mess, but at least they have money, right? Abram may have said, see, honey, it all worked out. Isn't it great? I don't know that she would have agreed. But fast forward to chapter 15, God tells Abram, hey, remember that promise about making you a great nation? I'm going to give you a son. I know you're old, but I'm going to give you a son. At this point, Abram, because he's old, he said, well, I'm not going to have a son, so I need to pick somebody. So he picks, I guess, his favorite young servant named Eleazar and says, well, that's going to be my heir. And God says, no, that's not going to be your heir. I'm going to give you a son. But when we get to our text today, we find out that 10 more years pass and there's no son. So you can imagine how messy this marriage had become. But let's look at Genesis chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. It says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant, that it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. You see why I give you the backstory. You see why I said, hey, remember the fact that they were given servants in Egypt. We know where Hagar came from. Hagar was a gift from Pharaoh to this family. Well, really a gift to Abram, and then now a gift to Abram. Abram was like, hey, you know, I did that really, at least you can have Hagar. Hagar can be your maidservant. But did anyone notice the similarities? If you're familiar with Genesis 3, we looked at it 2 weeks ago, the similarities in the language used in Genesis 3 and in the language used in Genesis 16, it's the same. We read in Genesis 3 that the woman said, she took the fruit, she gave to her husband. Well, in Genesis 16, the woman said, well, she has a name this time, Sarai said, she took the servant, she gave to her husband. The writer, the author of Genesis wants us to see, hey, this is like the same thing happening again. And this is like the first example that we have of a family after that first family. We have Noah's family, kind of, like we don't get that much about them, but then here we get it. So it's like that family, this family, your family, my family. These things keep happening. We keep falling in to these situations, getting ourselves into messes. You know what would have been better? Just because I think this does keep happening. When they're in this situation where they say, well, we don't know like how this is going to work, it would have been better if they said, hey, God, what's going on? Hey, God, what do you want us to do? But instead of doing that, they make a mess. I wonder if anyone here can relate. But I want you to know that, that them having a child through a servant, while unsettling to us today, was a common practice in their day. There's laws about it. If you look in the code of the law of Hammurabi, you'll find laws about having a child through your maidservant from back in the day. It was their way of doing surrogacy. It's definitely different than surrogacy today, but this is how they did it, right? Because if you did it in the way they're talking about it, well, then biologically the child is the surrogate mother and the dad, not the parents that are having the child. So anyways, that's what they were doing. But I do believe, even though it's commonly practiced, we're meant to see that their actions were sinful. I don't know if this is sinful in every circumstance in that day. I can't speak to that, but I believe that the author is making us see that this was a sinful action that Sarai and Abram took. It says in verse 3 that Sarai gave Hagar to her husband as a wife. As a wife. And if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you're like, well, many men in the Old Testament had multiple wives, and I would say you're right. But show me in the Old Testament or the New Testament where it says God's okay with them having multiple wives. We don't find it. In fact, what we find before the first family is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Not before the first family, with the first family. And it says this, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. There's no mention of wives plural. There is no talk of how a man and multiple women could be one flesh. I think that's illogical to think that could even be the case. And so they're choosing to operate outside of God's design. So what we have here is a couple who'd been given a promise by God a decade earlier, but had grown impatient and then decided to take matters into their own hands. Here's our first point for today. Sinning when we feel like God has failed only makes things messier. So I'm not saying there's no reason for Sarai to suggest this. It was culturally acceptable, but God had called Abram and Sarai as his people to be his people. And so one thing that I hope you know as a follower of Jesus, as the people of God, just because something's culturally acceptable doesn't mean God's cool with it. Doesn't mean it's best. Doesn't mean it's how God wants us to operate. And we're going to find this. I think we do find it, but we're going to find it more and more as time goes on where we live, that there are going to be things that are culturally acceptable, celebrated, all of that, and it's not what God wants for us. To make matters worse in the situation, make it more messy, Sarai likely blamed herself for the situation. Today, if you are unable to have children, you can actually go to a doctor and they can tell you why. In this day, they just automatically assumed it was the woman. And in this case, it actually was the woman, but it's not always the woman. And so she would have felt shame and felt less than and all of that because of this. And what happened here is the other people would look down on her because in this day, which this is not true, by the way, but in this day, they would look at the woman and say, your value is in your ability to produce a male offspring for your husband. And like, what if you have 4 girls in a row, 5 girls, 6 girls, 7? I guess you keep going until you have a boy. There's people that do that today too, but just saying, that's the way the world was that Sarai found herself living in. And if you keep reading in Genesis, you'll find that God did not say, well, you know what? I had a better plan, but since you did this, we're just going to go with your plan, and that'll be the heir. God doesn't do that. He says, no, actually, that's not. I'm still going to do what I'm going to do, and you just made a mess, And if you're honest, we still deal with the mess today. And some of you know what I'm talking about. But let's keep reading. Let's see what happens. Look at verse 4. It says, and he went in to Hagar, this is Abram, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. News flash, you're both wrong. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. And Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So here's the situation. Hagar gets pregnant by Abram. She starts to show, and then she looks with contempt at Sarai. The NIV says she despises Sarai. We aren't told why, but we can guess, right? There's a couple of things we might guess at, right? Maybe she knows that because even though the child is biologically hers, she's expected to, once the child is born, say, here's your child. Or maybe she's upset because she wanted to have her first child with her own husband one day, and that's being taken from her because she has no rights as a maidservant. Or maybe she just wanted to make Sarai feel bad. That seems like a natural response to me. Abram and Sarai, by the way, are a little bit older, 70s, 80-year-olds. Hagar was not that old. Some scholars would say she maybe was just 18, but she's not anywhere near their age. And so you can imagine a teenager dealing with 70, 80-year-olds, forcing them to do things that they don't want to do. But Sarai loses it. She goes to Abram and says, it's all your fault. And I just imagine Abram's face being like, You want to explain that one to me? It's all my fault. All I did was listen to you. And I do think that part of it was Abram's fault because he went through with it. But he did what his wife asked him to do, or at least his wife suggested. Maybe she wanted him to say, that's a terrible idea, we'll just wait on the Lord. Maybe that's what she wanted him to say. I don't know, but we aren't told. So that would be an argument from silence. But his response is terrible. It's to let Sarai do whatever she wants to do to Hagar. Whatever she wants. And so she deals with her harshly. And I think if we were to have an explanation of what that meant, based on what we're going to see later, that it was terrible. She treated her terribly. Again, I see this as another failure on Abram's part. He sits back while Sarai mistreats the mother of his child to the point that Hagar feels she has no choice but to flee. What could Abram have done? Well, let me think. He could have said, I made a mistake. He could have, if he wasn't afraid of her, said, we made a mistake. Shouldn't have done this. Let's ask God what we should do. The thing about life is you're going to make mistakes. You're going to find yourself in situations that you wish you weren't in, but at that point, all you can do is make the next right decision. You're like, well, I wish I could rewind the tape, but you can't. So you find yourself in a spot, and you say, well, you know the saying, like, two wrongs don't make a right? Like, it's like, well, you did something wrong, so now there's another wrong. Okay, you've had this, you're having this child with this servant. You shouldn't have done that, but now, hey, you know what? You're mad at her, whatever you want to do. Abuse her, mistreat her, treat her harshly, do whatever you feel like. I don't care. It's terrible. So things just keep getting messier and messier. Look at verse 7 and following. God's going to get involved. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. We're like, what? Go back to mistreatment? Didn't you read verse 5 or 6 where it says she treated her harshly? Come on, angel. What are you doing? Here's a point that I think is interesting to note is where she was likely going. It says that she was in the wilderness on the way to Shur, so that is on the way to Egypt. So there's pretty much universal agreement that Hagar was going back to Egypt, and it seems that God did not want her to go there, so he sends an angel. But the angel continues. See, I think it's very interesting that if the angel started with what he's about to say and then said at the end, go back, it would be like, okay, I get it. But the angel starts with the hard thing and then gives the promises, and it's very interesting. But remember, there's no pause; it just continues. So the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." You know, we can get so caught up in what verse 12 says that we miss the great theological truth of verse 11. Yes, Ishmael is going to be a wild man. Yes, it's good. There's good evidence that Ishmael is the father of the Arab people. But that's not what is catching my attention as I study this and as I share this with you. What catches my attention is this: the Lord has listened to your affliction. Not your prayers, your affliction. There is no evidence that Hagar prayed a single time. But it says the Lord listened to her affliction. The word affliction is the same word used in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, when God appears to Moses and he says, "Moses, I've seen the affliction of my people. I'm going to use you to deliver them." What was that situation? Slavery in Egypt. Kind of like what is it called? The tide has turned later. But it tells us that what Hagar was dealing with was not insignificant. What Hagar was dealing with was not an overreaction. What Hagar was dealing with was significant mistreatment at the hands of people who called themselves God's people. Think about Hagar's situation. She's living with Abram and Sarai, people who had been called by God to move, people who would have said, the reason we have riches is because God told us to leave, and on the way, they probably left out all the lying part, on the way, we got all this stuff. We got you because we follow God. Imagine that. They do not give her a good picture of what God is like, who God is, and so God shows up and reveals himself to her. He says, the Lord has heard your affliction. He's listened to your affliction. And we know that he wants her to remember this because he tells her, say, you're going to have a son and you're going to name his name Ishmael, which means the Lord hears. Imagine that. If you're a mother and you have your son playing and you need to call him, Ishmael. She's saying, the Lord hears. Every day. How many times a day? I don't know, 50? The Lord hears, the Lord hears, the Lord hears, the Lord hears. She can't forget it because her son is named the Lord hears. But what we have here, let's just put it in modern, this is a gender reveal on steroids. I mean, for real. There's no way in this day of knowing whether you're going to have a boy or a girl. How would they have known that? You had to wait for the baby to come out. Then you find out. And they only wanted boys, really, so they would be like, is it a boy or is it a disappointment? And they would have one or the other, right? But I say it's on steroids because they don't just find out she doesn't just find out it's going to be a boy. She finds out how he's going to behave as a man. Wild donkey of a man. Everybody's going to fight him and he's going to fight them. That's what your son's going to be. But did you know this is the first time an angel appears to a mother in the Bible and tells her that she's going to have a son? If you've read the New Testament, you'd be like, well, that sounds familiar. You don't have to ever read very far. Just read the Gospels, right? We hear of an angel appearing to John the Baptist's mother, an angel appearing to Jesus' mother. And that's all cool, but I don't want you to miss this point. is this, that God knows how hard life is for you in this messy world. God knows how hard life is for you in this messy world. I say that because God doesn't just know how hard life is generally. I think most of us would agree, well, God has an understanding that life is hard, period. But no. This story shows us that God knows how hard life is for you, specifically the challenges that you're dealing with. You may find in life that there are things that you go through that no one else understands. And I say that not being like just trying to like say that as just throw it out there. I mean it. There might be things in life that you go through that you talk to people about and no one gets it. You're like, you don't get it. But God gets it. God understands. Hagar didn't have any say in whether she'd be a maidservant. She was a present from Pharaoh. Hagar didn't have any say in whether she was going to have a child for Abram and Sarai. She had no rights. She's a maidservant. That's how it was. Today, you may be in a situation that you feel like, hey, nobody gets it. Nobody understands. Nobody can relate. I want you to know that God sees you as you struggle. Listen, even if you played a part in causing the situation, God sees it. He sees it. He's a God of compassion. God knows how hard it is to live in this life, and he knows specifically how hard it is for you to live in this life. And he can meet you in the midst of your pain just like he met Hagar. I don't know about you, but I find that comforting. I find it comforting to know that there is always one person who will get me. There is always one person who will understand the pain that I feel. One of the things that I'm learning as I grow older, I'm still young, but one of the things I'm learning is that emotional pain can be way more hard to deal with than physical pain. Some of you might be able to relate. But just so there's no confusion about how Hagar felt when the angel told her all this, I want you to look at verse 13 and 14. It says, so she, it's Hagar, called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. See, Hagar felt seen. Hagar felt looked after. She's not complaining. How come you had to spoil it? If my son was going to be a wild man, at least let me have like the first 5 years of enjoyment before I have to worry about him killing people. No, she's grateful. She's grateful that God met her as she fled, that God did not allow her to go to Egypt. Remember, she says this after being told, you're going to go back. This is what God wants you to do. Go back to Sarai. Go back to the person that has mistreated you. And the name that Hagar gives for God in Hebrew is El Roi, the God who sees. Did you know that Hagar is the only person in the Bible that gets to give God a name? In the entire Bible. There's lots of names for God, but God gives them to himself. Hagar gives God the name El Roi. An Egyptian maidservant gets to name God. If there was someone who might have said, God doesn't see me, doesn't care about me, doesn't listen to me, it'd be Hagar. But we get the example of the person who gets to give God this name of someone who we might say God wouldn't care about. But he does. But here's the thing about the name El Roi, the name, the God who sees. Depending on how your life has been, even how your last week has been, even how yesterday was, you might hear that and say, the God who sees, and that might produce fear in you. The God who sees. He saw what I did yesterday? Oh no, that's not good. But I want you to know that that's not what the God who sees is meant to do to you. This name is meant to be comforting to you. It's our last point for today, and it's this. It's what Hagar realized. God doesn't just see you, he sees the future. God doesn't just see you, he sees the future. What God does for Hagar is he tells her her future. He tells her that she's having a son. She didn't know that. He tells her that he's going to multiply her offspring, which means that her son will live and she will live. Listen, in this day, bigger deal than someone being asked to have a child for someone is the high chance that you would die in childbearing. So you're saying, hey, risk your life because we want to have a kid. That's what they were doing. She doesn't know if she's going to survive that. I'm sure she saw people die. But God says, no, I'm going to multiply your offspring. Your son's going to live. You're going to live. We're talking about things she might not have known for months, years, or even 2 decades. Multiply your offspring. She hasn't even had her offspring yet. He's got to live like what? 18 years, 20 years. Like, you got to live some number of years before you can have kids. We're talking about knowing about stuff that's 20 years in the future. God knows what the future holds. What's true for Hagar is true for you and for me. God doesn't just see you and see me, he sees the future. He knows what the future holds. This is one of those things where you say, if you knew what life would be like next year, there's a lot of things that you worry about, stress about, lose sleep over that you wouldn't lose sleep over. You wouldn't stress about because you don't see it, but God sees it. God sees the future. Because this is true, I believe it's good reason to say we can trust God with everything. When he tells us to do something, we know that he's not telling us to do something saying, well, we'll see how it turns out. It's not how God is. When God tells Hagar to go back to Sarai, he knows how it's going to go. And Hagar, after hearing all of this, she obeys. And we know this because of the next couple of verses, how our chapter ends. It says, and Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. You know, imagine Hagar coming back to Sarai and Abram and being like, I got to tell you guys something. Remember I told you about the producing fear that God sees? You know how you guys have been treating me? God told me he saw all of that. They'd be like, uh-oh. Right? We don't actually know how this happened, but we do know that something happens where Ishmael gets named Ishmael. God could have revealed himself to Abram in a dream, but the less if you don't need a miracle for that to happen. So it could just be that Hagar tells him, hey, an angel met with me and told me we need to name this child Ishmael. That could be. So it's likely that she had a conversation about her experience. But we don't hear much about Ishmael again. Not for 13 years. And then we don't really hear about him again. And so I think it's important that we just consider what we find about Ishmael in Genesis chapter 21. I want you just to just think about the fact that we're told a promise, hey, you're going to have a son. He's still in the womb. You're going to have a son, and then I'm going to multiply your offspring. That's not a lot of details, right? So the thing that's about to happen in Genesis chapter 21, there's no details. She doesn't know that is going to happen. And so what happens is when Isaac is born, the promised son, through Sarai, apparently Ishmael is picking on Isaac. I mean, he's a baby, but somehow that's happening. And Sarai, or maybe Sarai's perceiving it, or she's like, we don't need you here anymore, get out. But she says, hey, you need to leave. And they leave. And they go. And it says that the situation is so dire that she's wandering and she's out of water. And so she sets her son down and she walks away because she can't bear to see her son die. She'd been given the promise. Multiply your offspring. But she walks away. And then what we find in Genesis chapter 21 is that Ishmael cries to the Lord. The Lord hears it. And this is what it says in Genesis chapter 21, verse 20. And put that on the screen for me. It says, and God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. I share that with you because I think it's an encouragement to know that even in these situations where, first off, there's a promise that they're going to multiply their offspring, but in the moment of facing death, you still feel those human emotions. You still feel like, God, are you going to show up? And he does. And he doesn't just show up in that moment. It says God is with the boy as he grew up. God knew this would happen even when Ishmael is still in the womb when the angel appears to Hagar. He knew that Hagar was going to become a single mother. But he also knew that he was going to be with them. I find that encouraging. Before I let you go, I want to give you some next steps. I really just have one based on today's message and then 3 encouragements to participate in some other things that are going on that we've already talked to you about. So if you would, get your phone out, scan the QR code. That'll bring up our Connect card so you can fill it out. On the Connect card, what you're going to find are place to put your name. That's the easy part. And then it's going to ask you for your interests, prayer requests. On the interest list, you're going to see one for beginning a relationship with Jesus Christ. I want to encourage you that if you are listening today and you say, I want to know more about this God who sees me, this God who claims to know about my pain, know about what I'm going through, I would love to have a conversation with you about that. Because here's what the Bible teaches. As we fast forward, as we go forward, we find that this God that sends an angel to appear to appear to Hagar, he sends his son, his one and only son, to die on a cross, 3 days later rise from the grave so that you and I can be made right with God. I would love to just talk with you about that. All of us have made mistakes like Abram and Sarai and even Hagar. We all have. We all need forgiveness. But God made a way for our sins to be forgiven by sending his son as a sacrifice for our sins. If you check the box, beginning a relationship with Jesus, I would love to have a conversation with you this week. And I'll know that you want to have a conversation if you check that box. And so there's other interests on there you can take a look at. But like I said, one next step and some challenges. Next step A, trust God to help you navigate your mess. Look for him to show up. He sees you. He sees you. He sees the future. Trust him. 3 weeks ago, several of you took the challenge to start the F-260 plan. I think that was Easter that many of you said, hey, I'm going to do that. I'm going to read the Bible every day for 5 days a week for the entire year. And I want to encourage you to stick with it. Don't stop. Maybe you hadn't been experiencing God that much in a certain day. I want to encourage you, be consistent. Say, here, God, I'm going to be here every day doing this. Tell me what you want to tell me. Sometimes trusting God is as simple as saying, as simple as having the faith to say, God, I'm going to obey what you find what I find in your word. But I want to help you with something that's helped me. It's something called a thought trap. I don't know if you've ever heard of these. A thought trap is something where you are thinking, you kind of get stuck it keeps you from action because you're stuck. You're like, well, this could happen, that could happen, all that. One of them is called fortune telling. There's lots of different thought traps, but one is called fortune telling. I want you to imagine if Hagar got stuck in the thought trap of fortune telling. It's when he says, well, I know what's going to happen if I go back to Sarai. So God, I'm not going to listen to you. I know if I go back there, I'm going to get beat. Maybe she thought that. She's a servant. That could have happened. I know for a fact. That's called fortune telling. But here's what I want to remind you of. You don't know the future. It could go great. It could go poorly. But what is important is not how it's going to go. What's important is, what does God want you to do? Is what I'm about to do honoring to God? And listen, sometimes what you'll find is the things that you're stuck and you can't take action on, you do them and you're like, well, that wasn't that bad. But it's because you obeyed God and not your feelings. We sang it. Did you mean it? Right? We sang it in the song Spirit, Lead Me. All right, next step B. Sign up for next week's parent training. We're going to extend sign up on this through Tuesday night at midnight. We were going to cap it at a certain number to be in the student room, but we're already beyond that, so it's going to be in here. So no excuses. You're not taking someone's spot. If this is a training that you think will be helpful for you, remember we're flying in Glenn Stanton from Focus on the Family. He'll take the stage and preach Sunday morning, and then he'll also be doing the parent training and the youth group that night. But what I'm encouraging you to sign up for is the parent training after this service next week, and it's on navigating LGBTQ issues with your kids, right? It's messy stuff. It's important stuff. I want to encourage you to be there and to learn what you can. You'll be able to ask questions, and just it's going to be a great time. And so you should have got an email with the link to do that. And if you did not, just put it on your Connect card. I want to go to the training. We'll email you the link. That way we can get you on the list. Next step C, consider the Safe Families program. Again, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and the reason I bring it up in this message is because there are people living in our county who are dealing with situations not unlike what we just read about. Situations where children have parents that are really struggling to keep them safe, struggling to provide for them, struggling to just be a healthy environment. And we have an opportunity to be a part of this program, but it takes individual families saying, hey, I'll open up my house. Hey, I'll help. I'll do this. We heard about it a couple weeks ago, so I just bring it up again. It's run by Building Families for Children. By the way, our tradition on Mother's Day, instead of giving you trinkets, instead of giving you those, we were told they're just like junk, so you don't want it. So we stopped giving it, but we use that same budget and give a gift to Building Families for Children, which will help a family that is in need. But what they really need right now are volunteers for the Safe Families program. You don't have to be a family that would take a child in while families can get back on their feet. You could be a support family, a family friend is what they call it, where you can just kind of support and be there, someone to talk to, someone who maybe would help with dinner, different things like that. And so I want to encourage you, maybe you were praying about it. That was my challenge when we first brought it up, to keep praying about it if you don't have an answer. And if you do have an answer and you just forgot, share it, so that we can get you in the process, because there are kids who need help, who need safe families. And so I want to encourage you, consider that again. And lastly, this one is quick. It's for husbands. Offer to take the kids during the women's brunch. You heard about it earlier. I just say that because I say that the word is offer, right? Not say yes, because sometimes moms don't want to ask, right? And they feel like it's a burden to ask. Listen, it's not even, it's they call it brunch, but it's at 12 o'clock. That's lunch. So all you got to do is put some hot dogs on the stove, some French fries in the oven, and turn the movie on the TV, and by the time it's over, the mom will be back. It'll be all right. I want to encourage you to let your wife go to this. Encourage her to go to this.